He was a billionaire on his deathbed, and he asked the Virgin Maid to spend one night with him. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The main hall of the Atlanta International Expo Center was bathed in bright spotlights, their beams bouncing off the steel trusses of the high ceiling, while massive LED screens announced the opening of the National Conference on Technology and Digital Security. A quiet tension hung in the air. Renowned business leaders, sharp-eyed investors, reporters, and students filled every available seat. At the center of the stage, moments away from starting his keynote, walked Elliot Whitmore. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit, subtle in cut yet commanding in effect. The silver threads in his short hair gave his strong features even more authority. He was a familiar name. Founder of Whitmore Systems, a national leader in cybersecurity and corporate encryption. This wasn't his first time speaking at the event, but something about that afternoon felt slightly different. His steps were slower, his gaze more distant. Few noticed. Everyone expected just another flawless speech from a man used to success. The presentation started as they always did. Elliot took command of the stage with clarity and confidence. He moved through slides, projected market trends, spoke of yet-to-be-released technologies. Behind him, videos played in sync with each point he made. Then suddenly his voice faltered. It wasn't a technical glitch. It was his body. He clutched his chest. His shoulders gave in. His eyes went blank for a split second. Then he collapsed. The microphone caught the heavy thud. The audience stirred in alarm. Cameras swiveled. Crew members ran forward. Someone shouted for help before the medics were called. Elliot never regained consciousness during the ambulance ride to Charleston Medical Center. He was rushed to the emergency room, where tests, IVs, and monitors quickly surrounded him. When he finally awoke, it was to the cold white ceiling of a private hospital room, machines beeping steadily, the scent of disinfectant thick in the air. A doctor approached him with the calm, firm demeanor of someone who regularly delivered hard truths to powerful men. She didn't waste words. Liver cancer, advanced stage, no cure, just palliative care. 6 months at best. The doctor left quietly. Elliot remained motionless, staring up at the ceiling. The words circled his mind like an unsolvable code. 6 months, 30 years of building something, contracts, data protection systems, strategic acquisitions, economic crashes survived. All of it now weighed less than one diagnosis. He had no wife, no children. His parents had passed. His younger brother, a lawyer in Chicago, hadn't spoken to him since a legal dispute tore their family apart. That night, Elliot returned home. The mansion stood in south of Broad, Charleston's historic district. A stately old colonial structure surrounded by magnolia trees, white columns, and a silence that reached into the bones. He still wore the hospital's gray overcoat, his suit jacket folded over one arm. He entered through the main door, crossed the hallway, tossed everything onto a chair, and wandered aimlessly. The marble floors gleamed, the antique furniture stood unchanged, but it all felt cold, hollow, as if the house itself already knew it would soon be empty. In the kitchen, the housekeeper greeted him with a soft, "Good evening, sir." He replied with just a nod. He kept walking, reaching the back of the house, where he entered the library and stood for hours, staring at shelves full of books he didn't touch. Then, without a plan, he drifted down the hallway toward the bedrooms. That's when he stopped. A young woman was there, adjusting a vase of flowers on a side table. She noticed him approaching and startled slightly. She was 24. Hair pinned up simply, clean face, modest uniform. Her name was Grace Bennett. She had worked in that house for nearly 4 years, always respectful, efficient, nearly invisible, the way staff were expected to be in homes like his. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked, sensing his lingering gaze. He didn't respond right away. He looked at her as if truly seeing her for the first time. She held his gaze, didn't flinch. She was there, present. He took a breath before asking, "You've been working here for 4 years, right?" She nodded gently, told him she had started at 20 after caring for her sick grandmother and cleaning office buildings around town. He asked her to follow him to the study. She was surprised, but obeyed. In the study, he sat quietly in a dark leather chair. It took him a moment to speak. When he finally did, his voice was lower than usual. "The doctors gave me 6 months." Her eyes widened. "I'm so sorry, sir," she murmured, but he continued, "I don't want to die and be forgotten." The sentence hung in the air. She didn't understand it at first. Maybe he meant donating money, launching some foundation. But then he looked up and said calmly, "I want to have a child. With you." The words landed between them like a stone dropped in a windless lake. Her face went pale. "Sir, I've never been with anyone," she said, unsure what else to say. Elliot gave a quiet nod. "I understand." The silence that followed was heavy. He wasn't speaking from desire. He wasn't rushing. It was pain. "I'm not asking for love. I'm asking for trust. And the chance to leave a part of me in this world." She took a step back. Her heart raced, but his voice wasn't forceful or cold. It was a plea, raw and direct. She whispered that she needed to think. He simply nodded. And as she left the room, legs still trembling, he stayed there, staring at the door. The home he had built with such precision no longer stood as a symbol of control. It was now the place where he would finally come to understand what it meant to leave this world alone. The next morning arrived quietly. Grey light filtered through the tall windows of the Charleston mansion, casting soft shadows on the polished wooden floors. The house felt even more still than usual. Mrs. Hattie had given the rest of the staff the day off, and the air hung heavy. No vacuum humming, no clinking dishes, no footsteps in the halls. Grace had stayed up all night, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed in the staff quarters, clutching a pillow as if it could somehow hold back the storm spinning inside her. Her eyes held no tears, but her mind refused to rest. Elliot's words looped endlessly in her head. He hadn't spoken like a boss, and he hadn't sounded like a man seeking pleasure. His voice carried a different kind of plea, one Grace still couldn't define, but it had reached something deep within her. She got up early, though her body begged for more rest. The small room, with its pale walls and sparse furniture, was unchanged. She dressed in her uniform, pinned her hair with the same clip as always, and made her way downstairs slowly. She didn't expect to see him. She only wanted to restore some sense of routine. In the living room, she straightened pillows already in place, stacked dustless books, wiped down a spotless table. She needed to move, needed to keep her hands busy so her thoughts wouldn't spiral. She avoided the office hallway, avoided even glancing at the closed door, avoided recalling the tone he used when he said the word trust. The request lingered in her, not for the proposal itself, but for how it was made. No pressure, no hints, no promises. Just a straightforward plea from someone who seemed to have run out of other options. Outside, the back garden still glistened with dew. The hydrangeas drooped, heavy and damp in their blue bloom. It was the one part of the house she considered her own. Whenever she needed to breathe, she came there, and that morning was no different. She sat on the stone bench near the hedge, elbows resting on her knees, eyes focused on the leaves. It felt strange to think that, out of all the people in Elliot's world, he had chosen her. The maid, the one no one called by name, the one who moved through spaces as though she wasn't meant to be seen. But she didn't feel fear. She felt something closer to compassion, and maybe even something deeper, something she couldn't yet explain. When she returned inside, it was almost noon. The house was still silent, and the office door remained closed. She didn't knock. She just resumed her duties. She cleaned the shelves, organized the coffee cups, collected a jacket left on a hallway hook. Upstairs, as she changed the towels in the guest rooms, she noticed one curtain slightly parted. It was the window to the office, and behind the glass, Elliot stood watching the garden. She had no idea how long he'd been there or whether he had seen her, but she felt his gaze like a weight, just for a moment. Then he stepped away and disappeared from view. Grace continued her work, but a tightness settled in her chest. She knew she couldn't postpone the conversation much longer, but she also knew she couldn't decide based on the gaze of a man, or even on the weight of his diagnosis. She needed to understand what this stirred in her, and why, despite everything, she hadn't been able to say no. That night, after the kitchen closed, and the lights downstairs were turned off, she stood once more in front of the office door. She took a deep breath. The hallway was quiet. The entire house slept, except for her and him. She stood there for a long moment, hand raised mid-air, ready to knock. But she didn't. She returned to her room, slipped off her shoes, sat on the bed's edge, and opened a drawer. She pulled out an old notebook where she used to jot down recipes. On the last page, she wrote a single sentence: "If I do this, I need to know who I am before and who I'll be after." She closed the notebook and put it away, lay down without turning off the light, eyes fixed on the ceiling. It wasn't fear, it was responsibility. What he had asked of her involved more than her body. It was something deeper, and she knew that if she said yes, there would be no turning back. The following evening, just after dinner, she slipped a dark sweater over her uniform, styled her hair with more care than usual, and walked downstairs with steady steps. She stopped in front of the office door. She didn't hesitate. She turned the handle and walked in. Elliot sat in the same chair, hands resting on his knees, expression tired. He stood as soon as he saw her, but she remained where she was, holding his gaze. "I'll do it, sir," she said, her voice calm, firm, unwavering. "This isn't pity. Maybe I understand what it means to leave nothing behind." He didn't move. His face stayed serious, composed, but his eyes wavered. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "I'm not," Grace replied, "but I also can't pretend this didn't reach something inside me." There was no relief, no joy, just the acknowledgement that something had shifted. He took a step forward. She didn't back away, and when he raised a hand to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, she closed her eyes for a moment, just to feel the gesture. Then she opened them and met his gaze again. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was exactly what it needed to be. Because in that moment, what existed between them wasn't desire. It was a decision, born out of pain, and the wish to leave something behind in the face of absence. The night dragged on slowly, as if time inside the mansion had shifted to a quieter rhythm. After the conversation in the study, Grace walked up the stairs with calm, measured steps. It wasn't fear that made her move that way. It was the clear understanding that a decision had been made, one that couldn't be undone with time. The room she slept in upstairs was small, with a narrow bed, a worn-out dresser, and a window overlooking the inner garden. That night, the silence in the room felt denser, almost watchful. She sat on the edge of the bed, took a deep breath, and removed the hairpin slowly. Her thoughts came in heavy, separate blocks, each needing its own space to be understood. What she had agreed to wasn't simple. It had nothing to do with romance or curiosity. It was something intimate, tangible, driven by an urgency that extended beyond the two of them. She lay down with the light still on, staring at the pale ceiling and the slightly tilted lamp on the nightstand. Everything in that room felt different now, as if it too had changed. But what weighed most was knowing that, even after saying yes, there were still questions inside her she hadn't found words for. The next day, her body woke up before the sky even began to lighten. It wasn't anything external. It was the kind of rest that never finishes. The kitchen was still dark when she walked in. Cabinets shut, the kettle cold. The clock read 5:20. Grace washed her face at the sink, tied her hair with an old elastic, unband, and started making coffee. The scent of fresh grounds quickly spread through the room, creating a sense of routine where everything inside her still felt unsettled. By the time the first daylight filtered through the stained glass in the dining room, the table was already set, carefully arranged. It was how she held herself together. Elliot came in just before 8. He entered the kitchen without saying a word and stopped next to the counter. He was wearing cotton pants and a light-colored shirt. His face looked paler than the day before, but his eyes were sharp. She didn't turn around right away. She finished filling the kettle before facing him. When their eyes met, there was no smile. No thank you, just a nod, as if both of them knew nothing needed to be said. She placed a cup in front of him and stepped back, settling on the opposite side of the table. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was full. Every movement, every breath carried a new kind of tension. "It doesn't have to be today," he finally said, "or tomorrow." She looked at him, not surprised. "I know." And that was it, just coffee between them. As if they were already carrying a promise, unspoken, unwritten, but real enough to shift the days that would follow. In the afternoon, Grace gathered the laundry from the dryer and carried the basket upstairs. In the hallway, she crossed paths with Mrs. Hattie, who made a casual remark about the dry weather. Grace responded with a slight nod. It wasn't the time to talk or to reveal anything different. Deep down, she feared whatever existed between her and Elliot might slip out somehow, through a look, a movement. But until then, there had been no touch, no kiss, only a quiet understanding. And even silent promises change the way one walks the same corridors. In the room, she folded each piece of clothing with care, his sorted and in place, hers stacked on the chair. When she finished, she sat on the bed and looked at her hands. They were strong, skilled, but right then they trembled. That night, the mansion settled into sleep earlier than usual. The hallway was already dark when she came downstairs. The steps made no sound. Even the floor seemed to be holding its breath. She stopped at his door. She knew why she was there. Before knocking, she rested her hand on the wood, waited a few seconds, then knocked just once. Elliot opened it. He wasn't the man who gave speeches in front of glowing screens. He was simply himself, tired, ordinary, standing in the middle of a long farewell. She walked in. He closed the door gently. For a few seconds, they just looked at each other. There was no plan, no rehearsal. She took off her sweater, folded it, set it on the chair, and walked toward the window. The garden outside was dark. The flowers shifted in the breeze. When she turned, he was still watching her, not with desire, but with respect. She walked toward him slowly, stopped in front of him. She felt the air between them, hers held tightly in her chest, his more controlled. Then she said, "I don't know what comes next, but I'm here now." He rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, a wordless thank you. And when he touched her, it was gently, slowly, as if her body wasn't something to be claimed, but discovered. And for once, she stopped thinking. She simply felt the skin, the warmth, the soft touch, the sound of two hearts falling into rhythm. No words were spoken, just a moment of surrender and a choice. The next morning arrived wrapped in a calm that felt unfamiliar, as if time inside the house had shifted to a new density. Sunlight filtered through the upper windows with a warmer glow, more golden than on previous days. In the garden, the leaves moved gently under a soft breeze, and birds perched on the veranda railing, singing faintly. Grace was already awake when the sky began to brighten. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she stared at the floor, as if waiting for the events of the night before to settle into something she could understand. But nothing had faded. Every gesture, every glance, the way Elliot held her hand once everything quieted down, it was all still there, untouched. Nothing had been rushed. Nothing had gone beyond what she was ready to offer. He had listened, waited, touched her with care, and once they had laid down, he simply held her hand. She didn't feel exposed or regretful. But something had shifted. In that room, in the way she now existed in her own space, something that couldn't be undone. She stood in silence, walked to the bathroom, washed her face with cold water, and tied her hair into a simple bun. The cotton shirt she wore was one of her oldest, and the rolled-up sleeves revealed a faint scar on her left arm, a small trace of childhood. When she reached the kitchen, she found the table already partially set. Mrs. Hattie was preparing breakfast with her usual care. Grace simply said, "Good morning," and nothing more. That was enough. The rhythm of the house remained unchanged, and what had happened between her and Elliot hadn't spilled into the rest of the home. It remained where it began, in silence. She picked up a mug, poured herself some coffee, and stood by the window. She drank slowly, feeling the warmth of the ceramic seeping into her hands. Outside, the street life felt distant. Inside, what she felt wasn't guilt, and it wasn't happiness either. It was something undefined, like her body was trying to process something her mind hadn't yet named. Around noon, Elliot appeared in the hallway. His steps were slower than usual, his gaze lowered to the floor. He wore simple clothes and carried an absent air about him, like someone burdened by thoughts he didn't want to share. They passed each other briefly in the reading room. She was adjusting a curtain when he stepped near the doorway. Their eyes met, but there was no smile. No awkwardness either, just a quiet recognition. He said he'd be working for a while. She nodded with a small tilt of her head and stepped out. That was all it took. No explanations were needed. It was still too soon. And they both knew it. The afternoon moved at its own pace. Grace washed the bed linens, cleaned the study, reorganized the bookshelves, prepared a tray with tea, and left it on the hallway console. She did everything attentively, not absent-mindedly, but without letting herself dwell too deeply on anything. Time needed to pass a little more, to gain momentum, before anything could be defined. Only then would she be able to look ahead without everything feeling bigger than it actually was. Later, as the sun touched the tops of the garden trees with golden light, she went for a walk among the flower beds. The air was filled with the scent of lavender, and the stone bench under the tree seemed to call her back. She sat there with her arms folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the branches above. It was there, in that corner of the property, that she could think about him without losing herself. Think about Elliot not as her employer, not as a sick man, but as someone who had held her hand the night before, like a man grateful for something he could never repay. Grace didn't know if she was ready for what came next, but she knew clearly that in that house at that moment she had done something for someone who had no one else. And for now, that was enough. When she returned, the mansion was already bathed in dim light. She walked calmly through the halls, climbed the stairs, and entered her room. On top of the dresser sat a small envelope. No name, no stamp, just a folded sheet of paper with a short message inside. "Thank you for not giving me a little hope last night." She read it slowly. There was no need for a signature. She folded the note carefully and placed it in the drawer, without urgency. She didn't cry, but when she lay down, the room no longer felt quite so empty. And what she felt inside was no longer uncertainty. It was the strange, unexpected feeling that, for now at least, there was no longer any distance between the two of them. The next morning, Grace woke without urgency. The sky was still painted in soft hues, slowly lightening behind the tall upstairs windows. The note from the night before remained in the drawer, folded neatly, as if even the paper itself understood. The silence it held, his words, "Thank you for not giving me a little hope last night," echoed inside her with clarity. They weren't the words of someone misled, nor of someone regretful. They belonged to someone who knew exactly what he had asked for and what that gesture meant. Elliot wasn't looking for comfort. He didn't want tenderness or explanations. He had made a direct, real, possible choice. No illusions of romance, and she had understood that from the very beginning. What they shared was precise. A clean, conscious surrender, born from a desire that didn't demand emotional exchange. She had been there, so had he. Nothing more. Grace headed down to the kitchen and resumed the morning routine as if it were part of an old, familiar choreography. She made the coffee, warmed the bread in the oven, set out butter and preserves on the sideboard. Mrs. Hattie arrived, a little after 7, just as always, with her usual calm wave. They exchanged a few brief words. None of them hinted that anything had changed. And for Grace, that was a relief. The ordinariness of it all was a way to shield what she didn't yet know how to feel. She finished her coffee alone, hands resting on the mug, then went straight to the laundry room. Washed clothes, folded sheets, ironed his shirts with the same care as always. Everything around her looked the same, except for her. Inside, something had begun to quietly rearrange itself, slowly, inevitably. Late in the morning, Elliot appeared in the hallway with a neutral expression. He walked slowly, as if seeing a familiar space for the first time. They crossed paths near the reading room. She was carrying a bucket of cleaning supplies. He gave her a brief nod. A contained acknowledgement, just enough to recognize her presence, but not enough to interrupt his pace. They didn't say anything. But there was something in the way he slowed down for a second, in the way his eyes dropped to the floor before continuing. He wasn't avoiding her, but he wasn't seeking her either. It was as if they were both trying to find a new point of balance, where what had happened between them didn't need to be hidden or explained, just respected. That afternoon, Grace went out to take care of a few small errands. She returned with fresh fruit, bread, and a small box of jasmine tea, his favorite. She left everything on the kitchen counter, sorted through what she'd need for dinner, and headed upstairs to wash up. In the mirror, she noticed her eyes looked darker, deeper. It wasn't physical fatigue. It was something internal, a kind of exhaustion that had nowhere to rest. She changed into clean clothes, braided her hair, and walked downstairs slowly. As she passed the hallway, she heard his footsteps leaving the office. But she didn't turn, didn't speak. She simply continued, doing what needed to be done, as if the unspoken agreement between them included a rule that nothing should move out of rhythm, nothing beyond what was necessary. Dinner that evening was simple: warm soup, soft bread, tea served in silence. They sat on opposite sides of the table, the sound of cutlery marking the space between one breath and the next. He ate very little. When he finished, he stood carefully, thanked her in a low voice, and left. She gave a slight nod, gathered the dishes and brought them to the sink. She washed each one with precise movements, her gaze fixed on the foam in the water, when she heard the sound of his footsteps fading down the hall. Even the way his shoes tapped the wooden floor seemed lighter now, as if even his steps had begun to change their weight. She dried her hands on a clean towel and leaned against the counter. There was no sadness, but there was a waiting, one she still didn't know how to name. Later that night, just before going upstairs to sleep, Grace passed by the hallway outside the office. The door was slightly open. He was there, seated in the armchair, a blanket over his legs. He wasn't reading, he wasn't writing, he was just looking at the wall in silence. For a second, she thought about walking in, but she didn't. She kept walking until she reached the stairs. Back in her room, she sat on the edge of the bed, slowly removed her shoes, let down her hair, and took a deep breath. Then she opened the drawer and took out the note. Read it again without rushing, folded it back up, placed it inside, and lay down with the feeling that the days ahead would be different, even if nothing visible changed. Because now, everything carried a new weight, and she knew it. Grace's body had begun to react differently. By the end of each day, the fatigue felt heavier, deeper. In the morning, coffee had lost its usual aroma, and the simple smell of cinnamon on warm bread made her grimace. She already knew. Even before taking the test, before saying anything out loud, there was a certainty settled deep within her. She was pregnant. Ever since the night she spent with Elliot, she had been counting the days in her head without even looking at a calendar. The symptoms only confirmed what had already become impossible to ignore. She still moved through her routine with the same precision, but inside, everything was quietly being rearranged. And Elliot, though maintaining his usual calm demeanor, had started watching her more attentively, as if he wanted to memorize every gesture, every pause, every breath. Before time imposed an end, he no longer had the strength to deny. On a Wednesday evening, Grace left the house, saying she needed to go to the pharmacy. Mrs. Hattie didn't question it. Grace walked 2 blocks to the small local drugstore, bought the test, and returned along the damp gravel streets lined with hydrangeas blooming from the balconies of the historic neighborhood. She went straight upstairs, took off her coat, and didn't wait. The result appeared within seconds. 2 lines. Clear, undeniable. No surprise, no relief. Just the quiet confirmation of something that had already become part of her. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting in her lap, and stayed there for a long while unmoving. Then she washed her face with cold water, tucked the test into the back of her drawer, and went down to make dinner. Elliot was asleep in the library armchair, a worn book resting on his chest. She didn't wake him. She simply covered him with a cotton blanket and turned off the lights. The next morning, Grace woke up earlier than usual. She prepared the breakfast tray and brought it upstairs, just as she had done for weeks. But this time, she didn't leave it on the side table. She stood there, waiting for him to wake. When Elliot finally sat up with effort and opened his eyes, he saw her face, calm but steady. There was no hesitation. She stepped forward, placed the tray on the desk, and sat in the chair across from his. Her voice was clear and direct. "I'm carrying your child." He didn't respond right away. He ran a hand over his face, took a long breath, and finally said, his voice thick with emotion, "Thank you." There were no speeches, no shock, just a dense silence followed by a brief touch between their hands. He held hers gently, like someone who knows there isn't enough time to say everything, but can still show what matters. That same afternoon, Elliot picked up the house phone and called Nathan Cole. The conversation was brief and to the point. He explained what needed to be done: paperwork, updating his will, initiating legal recognition. The next day, Nathan arrived at the mansion. He spent over an hour behind closed doors with Elliot in the office. When he left, he didn't say goodbye to anyone. He simply placed a folder with notes on the entry table. Elliot withdrew soon after. He didn't come down for dinner. Mrs. Hattie brought his tray to the bedroom, as she had done on other days. Grace went upstairs a little later, gently knocked and stepped in. He was reading, calm as always, but his eyes looked more tired. They exchanged a few quiet words, and just as she was about to leave, he called her name and said softly, "You didn't turn your back on me, and that to me means everything." 2 days later, Richard Hale arrived at the estate. He was a tall man with a slow voice and reserved manner. A long-time partner in Elliot's company, he had come at Elliot's request to discuss business matters on behalf of the child. He spent most of the afternoon in the office. Later, he approached Grace with a respectful nod and carefully chosen words. "What you're doing goes far beyond any agreement. I'll make sure it's honored." She didn't reply, just gave a slight nod, her gaze steady. That night, the house fell quiet earlier than usual. Elliot didn't come downstairs. Grace tidied the kitchen, turned off the lights, climbed up to her room, and lay down with her hand resting on the still invisible curve of her belly. She felt alone, but not lost. She knew she was now carrying more than just a child. She was carrying the legacy of a man who had chosen to trust her, and even though there were no vows, no rings, no guarantees, she had no plans to leave, not out of obligation, but out of conviction, and that was enough. Grace's pregnancy was progressing with a kind of slow subtlety, but time was quietly marking its presence in their daily life. Small changes revealed what only attentive eyes could catch. Her dresses had become looser, her shoes now had soft, flat soles, and her steps through the halls had grown slower, more careful. Mrs. Hattie noticed everything but made no remarks. She simply adjusted the daily meals with lighter touches, fresh fruits, and herbal teas. The family doctor had begun making weekly visits to the house, always leaving detailed reports that Elliot read with an almost reverent focus. He never spoke about the future out loud, but every gesture showed that he was building one. Discreetly, Richard Hale started returning often, bringing folders filled with contracts, property updates, and suggestions for legal guardianship. Everything was handled with the kind of quiet discretion Elliot insisted on, firm control, but never force. Grace was involved in everything. She didn't fully grasp the legal details, but she understood what each document meant. It was his legacy, what he was trying to put in order while he still could. There were days when Elliot stood for hours, determined to maintain a routine, to remain present even when his body showed clear signs of exhaustion. And even on the hardest days, he still asked her to join him in the garden. They would sit beneath the pergola covered in green leaves, listening to the distant sound of birds and wind. They didn't need to speak, just being there together was enough. What they had between them had moved far beyond practical definitions. It wasn't about contracts anymore or promises. It had become something deeper, something built in the rhythm of daily life and the quiet trust they had grown between them. One quiet afternoon, he asked her to come with him to the main bedroom on the upper floor, a room he hadn't used in months. They climbed the stairs slowly, his hand steady on the railing, her steps close by, ready to support him if needed. When they entered, a folder rested on the bed, and beside it, a small, dark wooden box. Elliot nodded toward it. Grace opened the box gently. Inside was an old necklace with a matte gold oval pendant. "It belonged to my mother," he said. "I want you to have it. It's not a gift, it's a passage." She didn't say a word. She touched the piece with reverence, then placed it carefully back in the box. After a moment, she stepped closer and placed her hand lightly on his arm. It was the first time she had touched him in a way that wasn't tied to care or routine. Elliot closed his eyes briefly, as if storing the sensation as carefully as he stored his papers. That night, her sleep was restless. Grace dreamed of crowded hallways, strangers walking through the house, furniture being carried out, loud voices echoing off the walls. She woke startled and only calmed down when she heard the sound of water running in the nearby bathroom. Elliot was still there. His presence grounded her. She went downstairs, prepared a mild tea, and sat at the kitchen table. The baby was moving inside her more often now. The movements were still gentle, but regular. For the first time, she clearly thought about the birth. Where would it be? Who would be with her? What would she name the child? Lost in these questions, she realized she had already started to say goodbye. not with words, but with the growing feeling that her time with him was slipping away. 2 days later, Nathan returned to the house. He brought the final documents and, with them, a letter written by Elliot. It was for her. There was no sealed envelope, just carefully folded pages handed to her directly. "You can read it whenever you want, or keep it," he said. She took the letter to her room, placed it on the nightstand, and ran her fingers over the paper for a long time that night. But she didn't read it. When she woke the next morning, Elliot wasn't in his room, not in the library, not on the porch. Grace found him in the small chapel on the property, seated in front of the altar, his eyes locked on the old wooden sculpture. It wasn't prayer, it was contemplation. When she approached, he simply reached out his hand. She sat beside him without asking anything, and she knew the days ahead would demand a strength she hadn't yet discovered in herself. The rhythm of the house shifted. Most of the staff was quietly let go. Only Mrs. Hattie and a private nurse remained. Meals were now brought directly to his room. The sounds in the hallways grew rarer, and the days felt long and still. Grace stayed close to him, sleeping in a chair nearby or on a folded blanket at the edge of his bed, not out of obligation, out of choice. Their child was growing inside her, and his absence was already taking up too much space in her gestures. On a grey afternoon, as she held Elliot's hand, she noticed the strength in his fingers fading. But the hand was still there. That presence, even weakened, held something between them that couldn't be explained and couldn't be broken. When Elliot's eyes closed that afternoon, there was no visible pain, no warning, just a gentle, quiet fading. Grace didn't cry right away. The silence in the room felt absolute. She stayed there, holding his hand, for a few more minutes. Then she got up, closed the curtains, and sat again beside him. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was the end of him, and the beginning of the part she would have to carry on alone. For him, for herself, and for the child yet to come. The funeral was held at the small chapel on the Charleston estate, just the way Elliot would have wanted it, simple, private, without long speeches or public ceremonies. The guest list was short: a few former colleagues, some nearby neighbors, and 1 or 2 distant relatives who hadn't been seen in years. Nathan handled all the details with the precision of someone who knew exactly how Elliot liked things. Richard Hale took care of the paperwork with his usual efficiency, interacting with guests in a quiet and respectful manner. Grace remained silent throughout the ceremony. She didn't take the role of widow, nor that of an heir. She simply stayed, near the casket, one hand resting on her belly, already visible beneath the light fabric of her dress. She watched the faces of those who came to say goodbye to a man many thought they knew, but who, to her, had revealed himself in far deeper layers. Once the last guest had gone, Grace stayed behind. She sat alone on one of the pews in the quiet chapel and finally opened the letter Elliot had left her. The paper was carefully folded, the handwriting steady and plain. It was a direct message with no unnecessary words. He wrote about their awkward beginnings, the unexpected comfort of sharing a home with someone who expected nothing in return. He said that, over the months, Grace hadn't just taken care of him, she had stayed. And to him, that was the greatest act of generosity anyone had ever given him. He spoke of their child, making it clear that even though he wouldn't be there had always been love and intention. At the end, he made a request. "Live freely. You owe me nothing, but I owe you the peace I'm leaving with." She folded the letter carefully and placed it between the pages of his favorite novel, still lying on the library table. Then she extinguished the chapel candles one by one and walked home without haste. The next day, his body was laid to rest at the back of the property, beneath the shade of an old olive tree, just as he had asked. Only 6 people were present: Grace, Nathan, Richard, Mrs. Hattie, and 2 longtime family employees. No words were spoken, just the sound of earth being tossed into the grave, marking the end of a life that had deeply affected others. Grace stood until the last gesture, her eyes steady. Then she crossed the garden back to the house with quiet steps. The place where Elliot had lived now also held his absence, and that absence, though silent, was powerful, filling the rooms with a memory that needed no voice to be felt. The days that followed were intense. Richard began visiting more often, managing the reading of the will, finalizing legal records, and setting up the estate. Nathan led a formal meeting with the recognized heirs, including a distant aunt who arrived loud and left in silence. The reading of the document left no room for questions. The child Grace was expecting was Elliot's sole direct heir, and she his legal guardian. Elliot's decision was recorded in full detail and signed by all parties. Richard committed to overseeing the business affairs until the baby was born, with help from a designated legal team. When the aunt left without saying goodbye, the house felt quietly relieved. That same afternoon, Grace sensed a shift in the air, subtle but real, calmer, safer. She never returned to her old employee quarters. She stayed in the main bedroom, sleeping in the bed where he used to rest. She still prepared breakfast as part of her routine, but her movements were slower now, more deliberate. Mrs. Hattie began calling her Mrs. Whitmore without being told to, and Grace didn't correct her. Slowly, the objects in the house began to move, not out of necessity, but as part of an emotional reorganization. A few paintings were moved to different walls. Some flowers in the garden received extra care. Doctors started coming by more often, and the baby was growing healthy. Grace still carried her grief, but now she could smile, sometimes briefly, sometimes without even realizing it. One morning, under the blue spring sky, Grace received a letter from her sister who lived in California. It was their first communication since everything had started. The message was simple but warm. She wrote that she had heard about the loss, was sorry for not being around, and hoped to see her soon. Grace read the letter sitting on a wooden bench in the garden, the sun warming her feet. She took an old pen that had belonged to Elliot and wrote her reply right then and there. She told her sister about the pregnancy, the garden, the names she was considering for the baby. She didn't mention the pain. She chose to speak about what was beginning, about the possibilities that were starting to take shape. The end of winter brought more light into the house. The mornings felt longer, the air lighter. Grace walked in the garden often, reviewed documents with Richard, and had long conversations with Nathan about the future. No one saw her as a housemaid anymore, nor as a temporary guest. She was part of it all, part of what Elliot had left behind and of what was still to come. And even with him gone, Grace didn't feel alone. She carried the vivid memory of the man who had welcomed her, the child growing inside her, and a life that now belonged entirely to her. Spring brought a new rhythm to the estate. The garden bloomed with vigor. The air carried the light scent of magnolias, and the house echoed once again with the sounds of daily life. Grace remained present in every detail of the home. Her steps had grown slower, her body bent slightly under the weight of advanced pregnancy, but her posture stayed strong. Mrs. Hattie managed everything with care and precision, knowing that the routine was now more than habit. It was the foundation on which Grace was building her future. Nathan came by regularly, reviewing contracts, handling records, always ready to resolve whatever was needed. Richard Hale continued overseeing the legal and financial matters, careful not to interfere in Grace's personal decisions as the new guardian of the estate. Over time, Grace's habits became part of the house's rhythm. She walked the same path through the garden each morning, wrote in her notebook at sunset, and insisted on preparing small meals despite all the help available. That place was no longer just a mansion where she'd been taken in. It was the home she had chosen, to stay in. Her belly grew, and with it the quiet conviction that a new phase was approaching. Though the birth was still weeks away, Grace prepared with calm resolve. She chose the east wing bedroom for the baby, painted the walls in soft tones, and picked out furniture with Mrs. Hattie's help. She went into town herself to shop for the baby's first clothes. No one had to approve it. There was no doubt anymore about the role she held. One rainy afternoon, while folding little cotton outfits, Grace answered the phone. It was her sister, announcing a visit for the weekend. She said she'd come alone, without rush, just to see her, to understand the house and everything that had happened. Grace paused for a moment but agreed. On Saturday afternoon, she opened the gate to a woman who, despite the years apart, still carried the same look of childhood closeness. The conversation started tense, reserved, but gradually softened. Her sister walked through the house with quiet curiosity, listened attentively, and avoided judgment. At dinner, they spoke about their mother, old memories, and how much they had changed. Elliot was only mentioned at the end, when Grace said honestly, "He gave me back something I thought I'd lost." Her sister simply squeezed her hand, saying nothing. After that visit, something shifted inside her. It was as if reconnecting with her past allowed her to finally see the future more clearly. Grace began jotting down baby name ideas more often, shared thoughts with Mrs. Hattie, and chuckled quietly at the thought of what the child's temperament might be. Her nights were peaceful, filled with books Elliot had left behind. Sometimes she tucked little notes inside them, brief answers to questions never asked. It was her way of keeping the conversation alive, maintaining the bond even in his absence. There was longing, yes, but also gratitude. And that changed everything. In early May, Nathan showed up with an invitation, a gathering in Paris organized by Elliot's old friends, meant to honor his memory and celebrate the coming birth. Grace declined at first. She didn't want to be in the spotlight, didn't want to be seen as the heir to a name that invited speculation and expectations. But Nathan insisted. He said the occasion mattered, that Elliot's circles needed to get used to seeing her, that the child deserved to have his father's name spoken with respect from the very beginning. After a few days, she reconsidered. She chose a simple dress, styled her hair as she always did, and traveled with Nathan to the capital. The event took place in a refined apartment overlooking the Seine. Around 30 people were present, business people, artists, former partners of Elliot. Some watched her with reserve, others greeted her with kindness. The atmosphere was solemn but not stiff. Richard arrived later and handed her a small gift, a book on fatherhood with a short handwritten note inside. He said he was still available if she ever needed him. Grace thanked him with a genuine smile. On the drive back, she stared out the window for a long time before saying, "I think I'm starting to understand what he was trying to do. It wasn't just about what he'd leave behind. It was about what he wanted to protect." Nathan didn't respond. He just looked ahead and nodded. The next morning, back home, Grace sat in the garden with a cup of tea and her notebook. She wrote for pages about the trip, the way people reacted to her, the new clarity that was beginning to form. Her belly shifted now and then, and the kicks could already be seen through the fabric of her dress. Mrs. Hattie passed by and gently remarked that the baby seemed restless. "It's the world calling," Grace replied with a soft smile and returned to her writing. There was serenity on her face. And that house, which once felt too large, now felt just the right size for what was coming. The birth took place on a clear spring morning, when the trees in the garden were covered in young leaves and the air carried the subtle scent of freshly bloomed flowers. The mansion remained quiet, except for the hurried steps of Mrs. Hattie, who went downstairs to prepare the car. Grace had woken up with steady contractions and didn't try to deny the signs. Nathan had already arranged everything at the clinic, the paperwork, the admission plan, the instructions. Calmly, she got dressed, picked up the baby's bag, and walked down to the entrance hall. The hospital admission was smooth, no fuss, no delays. Her name was already listed as legal guardian. The father's name, Elliot Warren, was also registered. Every detail had been handled in advance. It was the kind of care Elliot would have taken personally had he still been alive. The following hours were intense, but medically uneventful. The labor was monitored by a focused team, and when the strong cry of the baby filled the room, Grace felt a wave of relief that reached both body and soul. She held her son in her arms and whispered softly, "You're here." The chosen name was already printed on his wristband, Luke Warren. In the days that followed, she remained under observation, breastfeeding patiently, receiving quiet visits from Nathan and Richard, and hearing her sister's voice over the phone each night. The housekeeper brought fresh flowers. No articles were published in the papers. No strangers showed up at the clinic. Luke's birth was private, intimate, shielded from any exposure, just like everything between her and Elliot had always been. Upon returning to the mansion, Grace found everything in place. The baby's room ready, the armchair positioned beside the crib, the towels neatly folded, and the soft scent of lavender in the air. There was no formal celebration, no grand welcome, but there was a quiet, almost solemn respect. The atmosphere was one of warmth and understanding, as if everyone knew that something definitive had just taken shape. She began nursing by the window, humming gentle melodies and reading aloud from Elliot's favorite books. Slowly, Luke began to fill the house. A blanket left on the couch, the sound of his cries echoing in the background, diapers in a basket by the stairs. The mansion stopped being just an inheritance. It was finally becoming a home. As the weeks passed, Grace began to take firmer steps toward reorganizing her life. She met with Richard to review official documents, spoke with Nathan about financial structure, and asked Mrs. Hattie to find a reliable nanny to help with the baby. She wanted to maintain her independence, but she also knew she wasn't alone anymore. At night, she still held Luke until he fell asleep. Then she'd walk the hallways on her own, pausing at Elliot's old study, touching the doorknob, and sometimes stepping inside. She'd sit in the chair where he used to read, staring at the wall as if his voice could still be heard somewhere between the books. 1 month after Luke's birth, an official letter arrived from the notary's office. The legal transfer of assets had been completed. Everything was now in Luke's name, with Grace appointed as administrator until he came of age. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note from Elliot, written weeks before his death. It read, "Everything I built is here, but the most precious thing will be in your arms when you read this." She read it silently more than once. Then she tucked it into the notebook where she'd been recording moments since the start of her pregnancy. She stepped out into the garden, sat down with the baby in her lap, and looked across the estate with calmer eyes. It wasn't just an inheritance. It was the space where love had been possible, and where something new would now be built. As the months went by, the mansion transformed naturally. The hallway was repainted, flower arrangements shifted with the seasons, and the sounds of the house now included soft giggles, stuffed toys, and improvised lullabies. Grace began receiving visitors, appeared at small events, and, after Richard's insistence, agreed to join the board of a foundation dedicated to supporting children, established in Elliot's memory. She wasn't seeking public recognition, but she wanted his name to live on in something meaningful. It was her way of giving back a little of what she had received. There was no dramatic ending, no solemn closure. Life with Luke unfolded through discoveries, routines, and new responsibilities. She learned to recognize his cries, to spot the signs of sleepiness, to smile at small milestones. She also learned to care for herself, her time, her health, her sense of self beyond any title. When she walked through the garden with her baby, she sometimes paused in front of the simple grave beneath the old oak, where the inscription read, "Elliot Whitmore, left love where time no longer reached." In those moments, Grace didn't cry. She just held Luke a little tighter against her chest, feeling that the future no longer needed to be imagined. It had already begun, and it was right there, in her arms. The end. So what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.